Hello, my friend, and welcome to the study for the Studies March Almanac. You might remember our January Almanac and February Almanac. So today we will augment our year with March. We will be talking about the spring as it is burgeoning all about us, and we will also take a trip to the magical Tintagel Castle on the coast of Cornwall. We'll use our paints, and pencils, and delve into spring. Spring is come to the northern hemisphere. The days and nights spent inside ourselves, inside our homes, giving way to an opening up and seeing life in nature. Blossoms are exploding and will soon be hidden behind the leaves that are opening up in joyous profusion on the trees and plants outside, just as our quiet winter spirit breathes in the energy of the new season. In the sky this month, we note that we've just passed the equinox on the 17th. The day hours and the night hours are the same length. And we have just passed the vernal equinox on the 20th, when the sun is directly above the equator. The days will now get longer and longer as we move towards the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. On the 29th, we look forward to a partial solar eclipse, where the moon will cast a shadow over a corner of the sun. In the sky, we can still see Jupiter and maybe Mars, but Venus will disappear and not be visible again until June. In the woodlands and forest, the ground flora has to grow and flower before the tree canopy bursts out and blocks the light. Plants like dog's mercury, wild garlic, and bluebells are all shooting up, and wood sorrel will not be far behind. In the limestone woods, the rare Daphne mezereon will also open its purple-red flowers to the warming spring sunshine. All of these are sources of nectar for early pollinators, as the activity on the forest floor has a small window before the top, casts shade from the sun. Migrant birds are arriving, and sunny mornings are scored by birds singing in the morning, throughout the day, and in the evening, getting ready for mating. March marks the start of the dawn chorus. Over the coming months, birds will sing and stake out territory, attracting mates with their new colorful plumage. British residents, birds that is, will soon be accompanied by early arriving summer visitors, and the birdsong will be profuse. Birds arriving include the lapwing, chiffchaffs, and wheat eaters have also begun to appear. Curlews, too, only partial migrants, have been nesting here and reappearing in mostly upland breeding sites, as well as little ringed plovers that are also returning this season. We'll paint ours with its beautiful little crown on the top of its head and the sheen of blue, purple, and green feathers on its side and the sandy striped ones under its tail. Warblers can often be difficult to see in the little trees and brush. Brown or olive green in plumage, they have sharp, slim beaks as they catch insects, the new insects coming off the forest floor. Due to the changing climate, there are small numbers of warblers that are beginning to spend the winter here in the UK. So we have them all year long now, although most of them complete a migration from their warmer overwintering grounds in Africa. In preparation for this journey, they feed extensively and have been said to double their weight. Sand martins will soon reappear, skimming over the water, performing aerial acrobatics, catching insects in the air. Their overwintering grounds were in the Sahara. The beautiful little finch, the siskin, has increased its range significantly southwards. Although they're most familiar as wintering birds, they form sizable flocks and feed acrobatically on birch and alder catkins. Another colorful bird to sight this March, the tiny lesser spotted woodpecker. The quick eruption of blossoms reminds us how quickly the seasons can pass by. And we're also reminded that it's important to slow down and savor these fleeting moments of beauty and life. In the forest, blackthorn is one of the first blossoms to come into flower. Cherry plum and pear will also be adding to the color on the trees before the leaves begin to appear. Cherry plum is a broad-leaf deciduous tree and one of the first prunus species to flower in spring. Lesser celandine, jonquils and hyacinths begin to cover the winter's bare ground. The woodlands will soon be full of the scent of the spring flowers that carpet the forest floor. In addition, the warmer temperatures of March bring the first moths and butterflies of the season with new, colourful wings. Built half on the mainland and half on a jagged headland projecting into the Cornish Sea, Tintagel Castle is one of the most spectacular historic sites in Britain. Its association with King Arthur makes it also one of the most famous, but the history of the site stretches back centuries before the first tales of Arthur. Tintagel has been inhabited at least since the late Roman period, and probably before. Between the 5th and 7th centuries AD, a prosperous community was based here. After a period of obscurity, Tintagel was named by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century as the place where the legendary King Arthur was conceived. This may have been what inspired Richard, Earl of Cornwall, younger brother of Henry III, to build his castle here in the 1230s and 1240s. The coastline of this part of Cornwall is fretted with picturesque beaches and narrow bays that resound to crashing waves. Above the high rocky ridges that project like fingers into the sea. These promontories were ideal for defense. They could be simply cut off from the mainland by a deep ditch. Relatively easy to maintain, they provided a safe area for settlement above the seaways, secure from raiders by land. Heavily defended headland settlements of this type are found in the Iron Age period, roughly the 7th century BC to the 1st century AD, and are common in Wales and Cornwall. These Iron Age peoples had been trading by sea with the mainland Europe. There is one at Barras Nose, to the immediate north of Tintagel, and another at Willa Park, near Castle. The Great Ditch at Tintagel may well have had Iron Age origins, although recent excavations are still ongoing. There have been occasional stray finds of flint or quartz at Tintagel's site, and both were used for making tools before the arrival of Romans at Cornwall in the mid-1st century. The evidence for a Roman presence near Tintagel is slight and comes late in the Roman occupation of Britain, which was about 43 to 410 AD. we know that the Second Augustan swept west and made a permanent camp at Exeter, near the Dobunni tribe. How far west the Romans ventured is not clear in Cornwall. A Roman milestone from the 3rd century was found in Tintagel churchyard in 1889, however. And these milestones that are found are inscribed with the names of the contemporary emperors, officially signposting roads running along the North Cornish coast. So it is not hard to imagine that as sea trade ports, the Romans would have at least moved about this area, if not occupying it with military. Pottery from the 3rd and 4th centuries has also been found both on the east and west banks of this river Camel, near Padstow, to the southwest of Tintagel. This pottery stems from northern Italy and Africa, as well as the Near East, different parts of the empire. In addition, there are small quantities of burnt oats, barley, and wheat grains that have been discovered and excavated in hearths. So many excavations yield more in the mystery of Tintagel's history. During the 3 centuries following the end of the Roman administration in Britain, in 410, population movements saw the creation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in southern, eastern Britain. This period is often referred to as the Dark Ages, simply because so little is known about it in detail. However, archaeologically, there's been a lot of discovery of imported pottery and extensive building remains that show that between the 5th and 7th centuries, Tintagel was a location of substantial settlement that enjoyed continued commercial links with the Mediterranean. Tintagel's importance within a trading network suggests that it may have been a fortress of the kings of Dumnonia, a post-Roman Celtic kingdom that included Cornwall, Devon, and part of Somerset. Only 2 of Dumnonia's kings are known by name. One, Constantine, was labelled a murderer and an enemy of the Christian life by his contemporary, the 6th century Gildas, the monk who has written a history of Britain and is the only Dark Age British writer to have provided any detail about the people and events of that time. Dumnonia survived until about AD 708, when the lands to the east of the river Tamar were annexed by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, and Dumnonia's king Geraint was left ruling the reduced dominion to the west. Archaeological record at Tintagel falls almost silent in the 7th century. It is probable that contemporary political changes affected the administrative, trading, or political function that Tintagel once had. A shard of glass from the 8th or 9th century and a coin of Alfred the Great may well have been lost by isolated inhabitants or passing travelers. The foremost figure, popularly linked with Tintagel, is King Arthur. There is minimal historical evidence for Arthur and nothing to associate him with Tintagel until the late 12th century. The earliest surviving mention of his name is in the Historia Britonum, the history of the Britons. This is a mixture of historical sources and folk tales in northern Wales that dates to about 829 or 830 and attributed in one text to a scholar called Nennius. We must be careful treating these as history the way we conceive history today. Nevertheless, they have their merit in that they exist and they show what people at the time were transmitting in their ideas, their stories, and their perspective on the world around them. This text, the Historia Britonum, presents two different versions of Arthur. One apparently based on historical fact. He was a Christian war leader who commanded the forces of the kings of the Britons against the Saxons, and one more obviously mythical, as we see from across the Channel in Brittany. A magical figure whose dog's paws made permanent impressions in the stone, and whose son's tomb varied mysteriously. At whatever length you might measure the tomb, it changes. Arthur was probably included in the Historia Britonum to please Merfyn Frych, King of Gwynedd, in North Wales, who probably commissioned the work. The first of a new dynasty of kings, Merfyn may have wanted to associate himself with a famous war hero believed to have repeatedly defeated the forebears of the English kings who harassed Wales in the early 9th century. There is evidence at about the same time Arthur, often linked with features in the landscape, was the subject of popular legend in Cornwall, southern Scotland, and Brittany. Arthur's enormous international popularity was largely owing to Geoffrey of Monmouth, who lived in the 12th century, died around 1154, said to be the favourite of Eleanor of Aquitaine, wife of Henry II. It was Geoffrey who first linked Arthur with Tintagel, describing it as the island fortress where Arthur was conceived thanks to the magic of Merlin the magician. In about 1138, Geoffrey drastically embellished previous accounts of Arthur in his Historia Regnum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain. By this time, stories of Arthur and his warriors were already known on the continent. Geoffrey described Arthur as a youth of unparalleled courage and generosity, joined with that sweetness of temper and innate goodness that gained him universal love, and turned him, as an adult, from a victorious battle leader into the greatest of a line of kings of Britain, and conqueror of most of Western and Northern Europe, whose renown had attracted the bravest knights of the continent to his court. Geoffrey also included elements of legend that depicted Arthur defeating a giant on St. Michael's Mount, along the southern coast of Cornwall. Many of these stories, we can see, will have originated from either a small historic event or figure, or an aspiration or hope in the times following the late Roman Empire and its dissolution. Despite the more obvious fantasies, Geoffrey placed Arthur in an apparently historical 6th century Britain, expressed in detail relevant to his 12th century courtly audience, and so provided the court of the Norman kings of England with a credible, heroic role model, previously occupied by a mythical Brutus from the Aeneid. Tintagel enters the story of Arthur when Geoffrey tells how Uther Pendragon, king of Britain, fell in love with Igraine, or Igraine, wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall. Tintagel is presented as Gorlois' strongest fortress, where he placed Igraine to protect her from Uther's advances. While Uther's forces besieged Gorlois elsewhere in Cornwall, Uther's advisor, the wizard Merlin, transforms Uther into the likeness of Gorlois. Uther and his companion set forward on their way to Tintagel, at which they arrived in the evening twilight. They are admitted by the porter to the castle, and to Igraine on the strength of their disguises. That same night, therefore, she conceived of the most renowned Arthur, whose heroic and wonderful actions have justly rendered his name famous. Gorlois is then killed in battle, and Uther marries Igraine. The river Camblin, the site of Arthur's battle, his last battle, was also placed by Geoffrey in Cornwall. It's highly likely that Geoffrey had visited Tintagel, or at least had a description from someone who had, and so knew of the great ditch, the ramparts and the ruins of the buildings that had stood nearby when the site had been heavily populated before the 7th century. Stories of Arthur's court flourished in late 12th century France, when the Plantagenet monarchs of England, Henry II, his Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and their son, the future Richard I, controlled an arc of territory stretching from Normandy to the Pyrenees. In 1155, about 20 years after Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia, Was, an Anglo-Norman poet and courtier to Henry II, translated Geoffrey's work into Norman French. He added details of his own, such as the Round Table, where no knight had precedence over another. The tales of knights of the Round Table became the pattern for a new order, a code of chivalry, the good conduct expected of a knight towards his enemies, his liege lord, his fellow knights, the lower orders, and women. It was the age, too, of the romance, a story in verse or prose, placing great emphasis on a knight's courtly and unfulfilled love of a lady, often the wife of his feudal superior or another lord, and how he would win his honor by deeds. A link between Arthur and his knights and the Holy Grail was made in the early 13th century in the Vulgate cycle, an early French source of Arthurian legend. It was later an important literary source for Sir Thomas Malory, and the image of noble knights engaged in this virtuous quest became a lasting part of the Arthurian myth. English kings used the legend of King Arthur and the associated order of obedience and loyalty to promote their own political standing and ambitions. In the 12th century, Henry II was said to have been involved in the discovery of a grave at Glastonbury, thought to hold the remains of Arthur and Guinevere. His son Richard I, or Richard Lionheart, presented a sword believed to be Excalibur to a foreign ruler. Richard of Cornwall, Richard Lionheart's cousin, and also Holy Roman Emperor, as we shall see, thought that building Tintagel Castle in the 1230s and 1240s would be a realization of his Arthurian fantasy. His brother, the King Henry III, wrote in 1232 of a type of tournament known as a round table, and his nephew Edward I was said to have taken a book of Arthurian romance with him on crusade. In the 14th century, chivalric virtues embodied by the legendary knights of Arthur's court were adopted as the standards of conduct in institutions founded by the king, Edward III, who reigned from about 1326 to 1377. He proposed an order of the Round Table, which was to be established in the same manner and condition as Arthur, formerly King of England. The king's teenage son, the Black Prince, who had been made Earl of Cornwall in 1336 and Duke of Cornwall the following year, with the titles held at Tintagel Castle. He was present at this occasion, and a building was begun at Windsor Castle to house the Round Table. The order, however, did not last. Instead, Edward, with the involvement of the Black Prince, founded another similarly chivalric order to consist of the king, the Prince of Wales, and 24 knights. It was called the Order of the Garter, and remains so today. Another story of Tintagel Castle is that of King Mark. It should be remembered that Tintagel is hardly mentioned in Arthurian romance, except in the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth and his followers. An educated European in about 1200 would sooner have associated the name Tintagel with the legendary figures of Mark and Tristan. King Mark of Cornwall first appears as a local king in legends from Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. In his 9th century life of St. Paul Aurelian, Almanac, a Breton monk, identifies Mark with a King Cunomorus who ruled Cornwall in the 6th century. This story of Tristan and Isolde was told also by Chrétien de Troyes and had as well some German versions. So it was a very popular story. Though originally part of this separate story, by the end of the 12th century, Mark, Tristan, and Isolde, or Isolde, had been drawn firmly into the stories of Arthur, Mark as its contemporary minor king, and Tristan as a knight of the Round Table. Arthur and his knights would have been the principal role models for boys in royal and noble households. Including Richard, second son of King John and younger brother of Henry III. He had huge estates in England and used this wealth to pursue a European throne. But though he was crowned King of the Romans, or the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, on 17th of May 1257, making him notionally the King of Germany, he never managed to translate this title into any real power there. Richard was made Earl of Cornwall by Henry in 1227, making him the most powerful man in the county. He visited Cornwall intermittently, and in the early 1230s he had to defend his rights as Earl against the representatives of his brother the King. Richard bought the headland that is Tintagel, and then the surrounding manor of Bosnay, whose name was later changed to Tintagel. By presenting himself as a worthy successor to King Arthur, Richard was asserting his royal status and his position within the country in terms of local tradition. By the later 15th century, the castle was once more described as being in ruins. In 1540, John Leland, the antiquary, noted on his visit, "The residue of the buildings of the castle are sore weather-beaten and in ruin." He made a plan of Tintagel, and here we see Sir Richard Grenville's plan from his survey of 1583. Despite Grenville's survey, the government of Elizabeth had no official use for Tintagel, and on the death of the last constable, John Arundel, in 1597, the post was abolished. Nevertheless, many details that were first supplied by Geoffrey of Monmouth or his successors were accepted as history by the 17th century antiquarians. And Tintagel firmly remains in the imagination today as a mysterious ruin, giving up its information bit by bit, but nonetheless retaining its mystique on the wild Cornish coast. And so, my friends, we have our study almanac for March. Tintagel Castle on the cliffs of the Cornish coast. Our partial solar eclipse. Our beautiful plover with its rainbow sheen on the feathers and crown. A bit of a hyacinth and our cherry plum blossom with little grass, baby grass coming up on the forest floor. It's easy to become overwhelmed or stressed in the spring, as everything seems to be burgeoning and happening. And amidst all of this opportunity and excitement that awaits us, all positive things, we need to make sure to take time out and observe the natural world around us, doing what it does best. And then we can ride this beautiful wave of spring into the burgeoning life around us, the activity, the opportunity, the excellence. Be good to yourself, my friend. Be kind to others and to plovers, and be extraordinary.